The morning Margaret Holt had my truck towed from the parking spot I had used every single workday for 4 years. I was in the middle of a live system migration that affected 47,000 customer accounts, and that only 3 people in the company fully understood, and I was the one of those 3 people who was currently sitting at the keyboard running it. I found out about the truck at 9:47 when my phone buzzed with a notification from my parking app saying the vehicle had been flagged for removal. I did not stop typing. I finished the command sequence I was in the middle of, verified the output, documented the checkpoint in the migration log, and then looked at my phone. The notification said my truck had been towed from Lot B of the Harwell Technologies campus at 9:31 that morning. I sat with that for a moment. Then I pulled up the internal company directory, found the number for facilities management, and called. The facilities coordinator who answered told me that effective that morning, Lot B had been redesignated as executive and senior director parking only, and that vehicles without the appropriate permit had been towed per the new policy. I asked when the new policy had taken effect. He said that morning. I asked when it had been communicated to employees. He paused and said he believed there had been a memo. I asked when the memo had gone out. He paused longer and said he would need to check. I thanked him and hung up. Then I looked at my calendar. I had a deployment checkpoint in 14 minutes that required my direct oversight. I had a call with the offshore integration team at 11 that only I could run because I was the one who had built the integration layer they were working against. I had a critical path review at 2 that the project director had told me 3 times was the most important meeting of the quarter. My truck was in an impound lot. My son Jacob was at school 11 miles from the impound lot. Jacob was 9 years old and had type 1 diabetes, and his school had my truck's license plate on file as the authorized emergency pickup vehicle, because when your child has an insulin-dependent condition, you maintain very specific emergency protocols, and one of those protocols is that the school can reach you and you can reach him in a predictable way. I had a deployment checkpoint in 13 minutes. I made 3 decisions in about 90 seconds. First, I called my neighbor Linda Marsh, who was Jacob's emergency backup contact and who had a key to my house and who had never once failed me in 2 years of being Jacob's unofficial second parent on the days when being a single father and a senior systems architect at the same time required more than one person. Linda answered on the second ring. I told her the situation in 40 seconds. She said she would handle Jacob if anything came up and told me not to worry. Second, I texted the impound lot the address of my truck and told them I would be there by 2 in the afternoon and asked them to confirm the vehicle was secured and undamaged. Third, I opened a new document on my second monitor and started typing. Not code, not a work document, a resignation letter. I did not send it, not yet. I just wrote it, the way you sometimes need to write something to know whether you mean it. I wrote it in about 8 minutes, in between monitoring the deployment checkpoint, and when I finished, I read it once and understood that I meant every word of it. Then I set it aside and ran my checkpoint. My name is Danny Reeves. I am 38 years old, senior systems architect at Harwell Technologies, a mid-sized software company based in Nashville, Tennessee, that provided cloud-based logistics management solutions to regional freight operators. I had been at Harwell for 6 years. I had been senior architect for 3. I had built the core integration framework that connected Harwell's platform to 31 external logistics systems, and I had done most of that work in the 18 months after my wife Sarah passed away from an aggressive cancer that moved from diagnosis to gone in 7 months, during which time I had also been Jacob's sole parent, sole support, and sole source of stability. I mention that not for sympathy, but for context. Because what I had built at Harwell in those 18 months, the work I had done while managing grief and single parenthood and a child's chronic illness, and the specific exhaustion of doing all of it alone, was the kind of work that defines a company's technical capability. The integration framework I built was the reason Harwell could pursue the enterprise contracts that had grown the company's revenue by 60% in 2 years. It was the reason the CEO, Margaret Holt, had been able to stand in front of the board 18 months ago and present a growth trajectory that had secured the company's Series C funding. I had built the thing that made the Series C possible. Margaret had given me a parking spot in Lot B as part of the compensation package she had negotiated when she promoted me to senior architect. Not a written contract about parking, a conversation, her office, a Tuesday afternoon. She had said the Lot B spot was part of what the senior architect role came with. I had been parking there for 4 years. The Lot B redesignation had been part of a facilities optimization initiative that Margaret had apparently directed in the prior week as part of a broader effort to improve the campus experience for executive and senior director-level staff. The initiative had included new furniture in the executive suite, a reserved coffee service in the senior director lounge, and the Lot B redesignation. I found all of this out later. What I knew at 9:47 was that my truck was towed and my son's emergency access was disrupted, and I had a resignation letter sitting on my second monitor that I had written in 8 minutes and meant completely. The 11 o'clock call with the offshore integration team went normally. I ran it the way I always ran it, which was efficiently and with the specific technical precision that comes from knowing a system well enough to explain any part of it without preparation. The team leads in Bangalore and Manila had been working with me for 2 years, and the call ran 40 minutes and resolved 3 open issues. I did not mention the truck. At noon, I walked to the project director's office. His name was Carl Briggs, and he had been at Harwell for 9 years and was the closest thing I had to an institutional ally in the building. He was mid-40s, direct, and had the specific quality of a person who had seen enough corporate situations to recognize one that was about to go badly. I told Carl what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The memo went out this morning at 8:52. I said I had been in the building since 7:15 and in the active phase of the migration since 8. He said, "So you had 39 minutes notice of a policy change that towed your vehicle." I said I had had 0 minutes notice because I had been running a migration. He said, "Danny." I said, "Carl." He said, "Tell me you're not going to do something that makes my afternoon very complicated." I told him I was going to the impound lot at 2 and that I would be back for the critical path review. He said, "And after the critical path review?" I said I had a letter I had been thinking about and that I had not decided yet. Carl's expression did the thing that expressions do when someone who understands a situation fully absorbs the implications of what they have just heard. He said, "Does Margaret know what you're running right now?" I said I assumed she was aware of the migration in the general sense. He said, "Does she know you're the only person who can run it?" I said there were 3 people who understood the system. He said, "Who are the other 2? I said one was on paternity leave until the following month, and one had given his notice 2 weeks ago and was in his final week. Carl sat back in his chair. He said, "So you are currently the only person in this company who can complete the migration that 47,000 customer accounts depend on." I said that was accurate. He said, "And Margaret towed your truck this morning?" I said she had. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I need to make a phone call." I told him he could make whatever calls he needed to make and that I would be at my desk until 2. I went back to my desk. At 1:17, Margaret Holt's assistant called my desk line and said Margaret would like to see me at 1:30. I said I had a prior commitment at 2 and could meet at 1:30 for 15 minutes. The assistant said that would be fine. I saved my work, locked my screen, and walked to the executive suite. Margaret was in her mid-50s, had been CEO of Harwell for 3 years following a career in enterprise software sales, and ran the company with the specific combination of revenue focus and human resources confidence that characterizes executives who are very good at the business side and somewhat less attentive to the operational side. She was not a bad person. She had hired me, had promoted me, had recognized the value of what I built in the ways that mattered for the company's growth story. She had also towed my truck with 39 minutes of notice on the morning I was running the most critical system migration of the quarter. She said, "Danny, I wanted to talk about the parking situation." I said I had until 1:55. She said she understood there had been some confusion about the timing of the Lot B policy change and that she wanted to make sure I understood it was not personal. I said I understood it was a facilities decision. She said the Lot B redesignation was part of a broader initiative to align campus amenities with role levels and that senior architects would have access to Lot C, which was a covered lot on the west side of the campus. I said Lot C was a 14-minute walk from the building entrance. She said the walk was consistent with what other senior architect-level employees experienced at comparable companies. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Margaret, I have a son with type 1 diabetes. His school has my truck's license plate as the emergency pickup vehicle. When they call me because his blood sugar has crashed and he needs to be picked up, I have 14 minutes less response time than I had this morning." She said she understood that was a personal challenge and that she was sorry for the inconvenience. Personal challenge. I sat with that phrase for exactly as long as I needed to sit with it. Then I said, "I need to go to the impound lot, and then I have the critical path review at 2. I'll be in touch this afternoon." She said she hoped we could find a resolution that worked for everyone. I said I was sure we could. I walked back to my desk, picked up my laptop bag, and called a rideshare to the impound lot. The impound lot was across town. The rideshare took 22 minutes. The impound fee was $215. I paid it, retrieved my truck, drove back to Harwell, and was in the critical path review at 2:03, 3 minutes late, which was the first time I had been late to a meeting in 6 years. Carl looked at me from across the conference table. I nodded. He nodded back. The critical path review ran 90 minutes. I ran my section of it, which covered the integration layer status and the migration checkpoint results, and answered questions that only I could answer because only I knew the system well enough to answer them. Margaret was not in the room. 3 board members who had been brought in for a quarterly update were, and one of them, a man named Robert Ashby, who had been on the Harwell board since the Series A and who had a background in enterprise software development, asked 3 specific technical questions about the migration timeline that demonstrated he understood exactly what was being built. After the meeting, Robert caught me in the hallway. He said, "Danny, how far along is the migration?" I said 63% complete, on schedule, with the critical path checkpoint passed this morning. He said, "What happens if it's not completed?" I said the customer-facing integration features that Harwell had committed to 3 enterprise clients would not be available on the contracted delivery date, and that the delivery date was in 11 days. He said, "And you're running it?" I said I was. He said, "Alone?" I told him about the other 2 architects, paternity leave, final notice. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I heard about the parking situation." I said I assumed he had. He said, "Are you all right?" I told him about Jacob, about the emergency protocol, about the 14-minute difference between Lot B and Lot C when his school called. Robert looked at me with the specific expression of a board member who has just understood something that changes the shape of a situation considerably. He said, "I'd like to talk to you tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, if that works." I said it worked. Then I went back to my desk and opened the resignation letter. I read it again. I still meant every word. But I had a meeting at 8 in the morning with a board member who had asked me if I was all right, and I had 11 days of migration left to run, and Jacob had soccer practice at 5:30 that I had not missed in 2 seasons. I closed the letter without sending it. I drove to soccer practice. Jacob played the way he always played, which was with the complete investment of a 9-year-old who had learned early that energy was a resource to be used fully when you had it. I sat on the sideline with the other parents and watched him and thought about the truck and the letter and the 8 o'clock meeting and what I was going to say to Robert Ashby in the morning. I did not think about it too hard. I had learned in the 2 years since Sarah died that the problems that required the most careful handling were the ones that benefited most from a night's sleep before you decided anything. I went home, made dinner, helped Jacob with his homework, checked his blood sugar at 9 and again at 11 the way the protocol required, went to sleep. In the morning, I had a meeting with a board member. And I had a letter that I had written in 8 minutes and meant completely. Part 2 is where I decided which one to use. End of Part 1, approximately 6,800 words. Part 2. The CEO had the single dad's truck towed. 1 hour later, her entire board was desperate to keep him from quitting. Robert Ashby was already in the small conference room off the main lobby when I arrived at 7:58. He had coffee for both of us and a yellow legal pad with notes I could see from the door had been written in a hand that pressed hard enough to indent the page, which told me he had been there for a while and had been thinking seriously. He stood when I came in, which I noted, and shook my hand and gestured to the chair across from him. He said, "Thank you for coming. I want to start by saying that what I'm about to tell you is not something I've cleared with Margaret, and that I'm speaking to you as a board member with a fiduciary interest in this company's operational continuity, not as a management representative." I said I understood the distinction. He said I spent last evening making phone calls to Carl Briggs, to the head of engineering, to 2 people who have left Harwell in the past year, and I looked at the integration framework documentation that your name is on. I said I had written most of that documentation. He said, "I know. I also looked at the enterprise contracts that reference delivery commitments that depend on your migration completing on schedule." I said 11 days. He said 3 contracts, total value to Harwell in the first year, just the first year, of $4.2 million. I did not say anything. He said if those contracts miss their delivery dates, 2 of the 3 have penalty clauses. One of them has an escape clause that allows termination without penalty if delivery misses by more than 14 days. I said I was aware of the contract terms because I had been in the room when 2 of the 3 were negotiated. Robert looked at me. He said, "Danny, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I need a direct answer." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "If you resign today, could anyone else complete the migration on time?" I thought about that for the exact length of time the question deserved, which was not long because I already knew the answer. I said no. He said, "Not with the architects on paternity leave and notice." I said no. He said, "How long would it take to bring someone else up to speed on the integration layer?" I said 3 months minimum for someone with the right background, longer for anyone else. He said, "So the 11-day delivery window would be missed." I said, "By a significant margin." Robert wrote something on his legal pad. Then he said, "What do you need?" I looked at him. He said, "Not what do you want, what do you need? To stay, to complete the migration, and to do your job without the situation that happened yesterday being repeated." I had thought about this on the drive in, not in a calculating way, not in the way of someone assembling demands, but in the honest way of someone who had spent 2 years managing an impossible set of priorities, and who knew, when asked directly, what the actual requirements were. I said 4 things. First, my Lot B parking spot restored, not Lot C, not a different arrangement. The specific spot I had been given as part of my compensation 4 years ago, because the spot was not about parking, it was about being 11 minutes from Jacob's school instead of 25, and 11 minutes was the difference between arriving before his blood sugar crashed and arriving after. Second, a formal written acknowledgement from the company that the spot was part of my compensation package and could not be modified without my agreement, because a verbal assurance from the same person who had towed my truck without notice was not sufficient. Third, reimbursement of the $215 impound fee and the rideshare costs, not because the money was significant, but because the principle of who had caused the problem and who should bear its cost was significant. Fourth, a conversation with Margaret that acknowledged what had happened and what it had meant, not an apology necessarily, just an acknowledgement that parking a truck 12 minutes further from a diabetic child's school was not a facilities optimization. It was a decision with consequences that had not been considered. Robert wrote all 4 items on his legal pad while I spoke. When I finished, he looked at the list and said, "That's reasonable." I said I thought so. He said, "Give me 2 hours." I went to my desk and worked. The migration was at 68%. I had a morning checkpoint at 10 that I ran cleanly and documented in the log. I answered emails, reviewed integration test results, and did the work that the day required. At 10:47, Margaret Holt knocked on my office door. I said, "Come in." She came in and closed the door behind her, which she had never done before in a conversation with me. She sat down in the chair across from my desk, which she also had not done before. Our prior conversations had been in her office or in conference rooms. Her coming to my office and sitting down communicated something about the configuration of the morning that I noted without comment. She said, "Robert told me what you asked for." I said I assumed so. She said, "He also told me things about the migration and the contract timelines that I should have known and that I did not know in the detail I should have." I said nothing. She said, "I want to address your 4 points." She went through them in order. The parking spot, restored immediately, effective that morning. She had directed facilities to put my permit back in the Lot B system before she walked down to my office. The written acknowledgement. She had asked HR to draft a formal letter documenting the Lot B spot as part of my compensation package, subject to my review and agreement, to be finalized by end of day. The reimbursement. Facilities would cut a check for $215 plus the rideshare costs, and she was including an additional $200 as acknowledgement of the disruption to my workday. The 4th point she handled differently from the first 3. She said, "Danny, I have a daughter. She's 17 and healthy, and I still sometimes lie awake thinking about what I would do if something happened and I was 40 minutes away. I did not think about Jacob when I approved the Lot B redesignation. I approved a facilities proposal without thinking about what parking distance means for someone in your situation. I should have thought about it. I did not. I'm sorry." I looked at her for a moment. She was not reading from a prepared statement. She was not managing the conversation. She was sitting in a chair in my office saying something she meant. I said I appreciated that. She said, "Are you going to stay?" I said I had a migration to finish. She said, "After the migration." I said that depended on whether the 4 things happened the way she had described. She said they would. I said then I expected I would stay. She nodded and stood and said she would have the HR letter to me by 4. She left. I turned back to my screen. The migration was at 71%. Carl knocked on my door at noon and stuck his head in without waiting for an answer, which was his way. He said, "You're still here." I said I was. He said, "Robert called me this morning He called me again an hour ago. I said I figured. He said he told me what you asked for. I said they were reasonable requests. Carl said he also told me that when he asked you directly whether anyone else could finish the migration, you said no without hesitating. I said that was accurate. He said most people in that situation would have let the answer imply itself, or hedged. You just answered the question. I said the question deserved a direct answer. He looked at me for a moment. He said Sarah would have liked how you handled this. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said she would have told me to send the letter. Carl said probably. I said she also would have told me to think about Jacob first. He said also probably. He left. The HR letter arrived at 3:45. I read every word of it, which was 2 pages and covered the Lot B designation clearly and correctly. I signed it and sent the signed copy back and kept a copy in my personal files. The impound reimbursement check was on my desk the following morning. I completed the migration on day 9, 2 days ahead of the 11-day window, which I had always expected to do because I had built schedule margin into the plan. The deployment was clean. The integration went live without errors. The 3 enterprise client systems connected without incident. Robert Ashby sent me an email that evening. It said 2 sentences. It said the deployment had gone live clean and that he was glad I had stayed to see it through. I wrote back 1 sentence. I said so was I. The migration completion report went to the full board the following week. Robert had asked me to present it directly rather than having it go through management summary, which was unusual and which several people in the room noticed. I presented it in 20 minutes and answered questions for another 15 and then went back to my desk. 3 weeks after the migration, Margaret restructured the senior architect role to include a formal compensation documentation process that covered all non-salary elements of the package. The Lot B spots for all 3 senior architects were formally documented. The process also covered other elements that had historically been handled verbally. Carl told me afterward that the restructuring had come directly from Robert's recommendation to the board following the parking incident, and that the board had approved it unanimously as a governance improvement. I did not know whether to call that a victory or just a correction. I decided it was a correction, which was what it should have been, and that corrections were worth more than victories because they lasted. Jacob had his semi-annual diabetes review 6 weeks after the parking incident. His numbers were good. His doctor said his management protocol was excellent and that the consistency of his routine was contributing to his stability. I thought about that word, consistency, on the drive home. The consistency of his routine included his father arriving in 11 minutes when the school called instead of 25. That was not a small thing. That was the kind of thing that does not show up in a facilities optimization report and does not appear on a balance sheet and does not get weighed when someone approves a parking lot redesignation. It showed up in a child's blood sugar numbers. It showed up in a father's drive time. It showed up in a resignation letter that I wrote in 8 minutes and kept in a folder and never sent. I deleted the letter 3 months after the parking incident, not because it had lost its meaning, but because I no longer needed it. The situation that had made me write it had been corrected. The correction was documented. The company that I had spent 6 years building something important inside had, when the people with the authority to act had understood what was at stake, acted correctly. That was worth staying for. Here is what I will leave you with. There is a version of this story where I send the resignation letter the morning of the impound lot, where I put it in Margaret's inbox and walk out and leave the migration at 63% and 11 days from delivery. That version of the story is satisfying in a particular way that the version I actually lived is not, because the satisfying version has a cleaner line from wrong action to consequence. But the version I actually lived had Jacob at soccer practice, had Linda never needing to use the emergency protocol, Had a migration that completed 2 days early and 3 enterprise clients whose systems went live without incident. Had a company that corrected a policy because the stakes of not correcting it were made clear to the people with the authority to change it. I chose the version with Jacob at soccer practice. I would choose it again. Document what you are worth, not with arrogance, with accuracy. Know which parts of your work cannot be handed to someone else on short notice. Know what the cost of your absence is in concrete terms. And when someone with authority over your situation makes a decision without understanding those terms, find the person in the room who has the authority and the inclination to understand them. Then answer their questions directly. Because direct answers to serious questions are how corrections get made. And corrections are what last. Drop your thoughts below. If you have ever had someone in a position of authority make a decision about your situation without understanding what your situation actually was, tell me about it. And if you have a resignation letter sitting in a folder that you have not sent, think hard about whether you have made sure the right people understand exactly what leaves with you if you do. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make that very clear. And then stay. End of part 2, approximately 7,000 words. Thumbnail text. She told the only man who could save her company. Big mistake.